everyone, and welcome to this week's On the Spot, where we talk about what's happening in the freight markets today and this week. And I'm here with, as always, John Paul Hampstead, Director of Passport Research. I'm Zach Strickland, the Director of Freight Market Intelligence. So I think it's no news by now, but we have had a hurricane make landfall in the United States, a major hurricane at that. And these are tremendous events for the freight market, as many of you well know. These can have long-lasting impacts to the spot market, to freight rates. As the infrastructure damage becomes more apparent, insurance adjusters come in, claims get made, et cetera, and a lot of the capacity gets sucked into these areas, and really creates an environment where truckers just kind of abandon. Or a certain section of capacity abandons what they normally do, and they go down and help the relief effort.
That's right. That's really what creates the outsized effects from these disaster relief projects, is when trucks and trailers sort of get dedicated. Whether it's a temperature-controlled trailer that's providing support for a certain kind of food, whether it's people making shuttle runs back and forth, resupplying some caches of food and blankets and various kinds of supplies like that. It's about the ability of these disaster zones to absorb capacity for long periods of time.
Yeah, and of course, back in the day, I actually worked on some of these efforts with the trucking company, and of course Donnie Gilbert here has spent a lot of time, David Bradford has spent a lot of time in some of these disaster recovery efforts, and really the story here is, a lot of these truckers, they make agreements with FEMA and the government, and they get paid, but they get sucked into these environments for weeks at times. You have to basically donate your entire, almost a month of your life to the relief effort, because it's not like they have a bunch of docks down there. They have to go in and offload these supplies, and there's no, there's not like a bunch of forklifts sitting there ready to offload pallets efficiently, et cetera. They have to store them around these areas. You have things like bottled waters, because they don't have running water in a lot of these places anymore, or it's been tainted or contaminated. You have things like Pop-Tarts. Surprisingly, Pop-Tarts are one of the big relief supplies that go down to these areas.
Right, high calories, long shelf life, that kind of tasty.
Right.
But no, yeah, I think that's an important point. When FEMA is initially staging loads, they don't know where exactly the need is going to be. They don't know how severe it's going to be. They don't know how long it's going to last, and so they're figuring that out as the drivers and the power units and the trailers are sitting sort of in peripheral areas, waiting to be deployed. And so that it takes time to sort through, and that's really, and of course, the magnitude of the destruction and the number of people impacted really kind of is the multiplier effect on how much capacity it takes to deal with these problems.
Right, yeah, one of the things that we look at, in terms of trying to figure out just how much impact that it's going to have to the freight market is the basic insurance estimate. Basically, how much is this storm's damage worth on the commercial side, more than the governmental side, because Hurricane Michael, as we were talking about before the show, Category 5 hurricane, really, a lot of damage to the military base.
So this is the hurricane that hit Mexico Beach, Panama City Beach in 2018.
Yes, yep. And not that much damage outside of the military base, but it was about a $10 to $15 billion estimated damage or cost. So not a lot of impact to the freight market itself, because the relief efforts just simply weren't needed because of the low population density. Not a lot of infrastructure. Mexico Beach was almost eradicated, but again, there wasn't a lot there. Storms in the past, such as Irma and Harvey. Harvey, of course, not necessarily a major hurricane when it made landfall, but it did end up just kind of sitting over the top of Houston, a lot of water damage. And this storm, to try to make a connection, this storm probably isn't going to look anything like a Harvey. The threat of this storm is largely from the fact that it's going to maintain strength over a long stretch of land that isn't necessarily accustomed to seeing the winds. And of course, there's going to be some flooding damage as well. And again, flooding is really the main cause of most of the infrastructure damage.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. When you think about Katrina, when you think about Irma, it certainly has to do with a vast amount of rainwater / storm surge over a largely asphalt area, right? And then the municipal infrastructure's ability to deal with that water or not, and how it deals with that, and then then how that affects damage to buildings, people, et cetera. I think you're right, though, to bring up the idea that you can look at the insurance estimates as an immediate kind of gauge as to how much capacity is going to be involved in rebuilding, right? Because when you think about if the insurance company is saying we're funding $20 billion, $100 billion worth of claims, that money is getting put to work rebuilding, and so that immediately starts sucking in resources, commodities, capacity.
Well, a lot of that money goes to purchase capacity. Yeah. So, I mean, you can take a certain percentage of it, and we haven't done a study. That might be a good study for the Passport research team to do at some point, is to figure out what the relationship is between the insurance estimates and potential capacity needed, because that's a lot of the reason that, a lot of these drivers will go down there and set up shop for months because
and they get paid like per diem, like rates and things like that, and they're they're contributing. Obviously, they're helping people in need. I mean, we saw how the transportation logistics industry showed up during some of the COVID food hoarding stuff in March, and how they continue to operate in a really, and sometimes dangerous situation. So, I think most truckers want to help and want to contribute where they're needed. So, I mean, people will be interested in how they can contribute. There's going to be a broadcast. We're going to continue to talk about what it takes to execute that kind of freight.
Yeah, and I think it'll be interesting this year too, because we're having a major hurricane landfall amidst a market that's already extremely tight.
Yeah.
We're already kind of in this ongoing natural disaster that's COVID-19 pandemic, and it's created an environment where we're seeing volume growth, 20, 30% year over year in some instances, and spot rates, of course, extremely elevated. We haven't seen these type of rates since 2018, and it's going to be interesting. Again, it'll take a while before we actually know the full damage estimate. Again, it's not like everybody rushes in right away all at once. There has to be adjusters that come in, survey the area, and then it may be months before we really see the full-on impact of some of this. But again, I think normally you see a week to 2 weeks later, you start to see a lot of people aggregate.
Right, and the way that, and there are other like infrastructure projects that could take a long time to repair. I mean, the way that the storm surge, for example, could affect like locks on the Mississippi River and all the various sort of lake and canal systems in East Texas and Western Louisiana. That could take a long time to kind of assess and repair as well. So it's kind of it's a complex issue. What are we seeing kind of in the market right now? I mean, I noticed some depressed volumes out of markets like New Orleans and Houston. Is there any indication that carriers are more or less willing to go in and out of markets close to landfall?
So two things. We're seeing volumes start to drop a little bit, as well as tender rejection rates start to come down in a lot of these markets. We saw that happen in Houston, Memphis, some of the surrounding markets around those areas. Again, a lot of these shippers are probably getting ready for not having to ship freight and maybe taking some time off there, especially around Houston as the port's been shut down for a couple of days down there. But tender rejection rates falling in New Orleans, I believe Shreveport, Memphis, Little Rock, all of those areas, seeing lower tender
people wanting to get out.
As people basically, and again, this is a market where we've seen tender rejection rates consistently on the rise, just about everywhere in the country at this point. So I think carriers are getting out of the way, and it'll be really the tell is what happens after the storm passes. We've seen this before in a lot of our data models where we see, with Florence, we actually were able to model out carrier behavior, as they were exiting.
And that was the storm that did so much damage to the agriculture and the livestock industry of North Carolina.
Exactly.
Hit Wilmington.
Right.
Pretty hard.
Yeah, and that was a $60 to $80 billion event. Didn't have a huge, long-standing disruption to the freight market. Again, the freight market wasn't necessarily overheated at that point in time. We weren't seeing as much activity. It was kind of, we were starting to see things kind of come down. So I think that absorbed a lot of the impact of that infrastructure.
And Wilmington's not a hub of transportation the way that, for example, Houston is, which is the third largest container terminal on the East Coast. Obviously, a center of oil and gas infrastructure, the chemicals and plastics industry, the fourth largest city in America.
Right.
So it's, it really matters like how many people get affected for how long and what the kind of damage is, right?
Yeah, and I think too, there's, silver lining to these natural disasters is the fact that there is a little bit of an economic boost. As the infrastructure has to get rebuilt. And, again, you have federal money flowing into an area. And Louisiana is not necessarily an economic boon by any means. But, it wasn't creating that much economic activity beforehand. But now you have this additional influx of economic activity. In an area that's largely not populated. So there is a little bit of a positive in some of these natural disasters. Obviously, you don't want them ever to happen.
You want people to get out of the way. You want power to be restored.
Yeah.
People, that kind of thing. Okay. So over the next week or so, how will we know if this storm has had a significant or even just an incremental impact on national freight markets?
I mean, obviously, the big tell will be spot rates, tender rejections, and sonar. For sonar subscribers, they'll be able to see that relatively quickly. And I think the important thing is knowing where that starts to happen first, because capacity is already tight. And my thought here is that rates are already elevated. How much more enticing is the government money going to be in a market that's already producing $3 a mile rates in areas that we're used to seeing $1.70 just this time last year?
That's a good point. And over the past 2 years or so, I've heard from logistics operators that work with FEMA that the agency has become a lot more intelligent about the way it prices. It does send out, it's not just doing like cost plus contracts, but it's actually sending out very targeted RFPs for projects to multiple carriers and brokers, and trying to figure out not only who can service it, but at a price that is somewhat grounded in reality, right? And so, to the extent that in different markets, we see these pockets of tightness pop up where trucks are essentially able to name their price. I think it's interesting to see what FEMA will have to resort to get the capacity it needs, if in fact there is a large need.
Yeah, I don't think we've ever really had, outside of 2005, 2006, when Katrina, and we had this slew of hurricanes hitting the United States, we really haven't seen this type of environment where you have a tight market and natural disasters at the same time. Some of those environments back in 2005, 2006, that's when I was, working some of that freight. It was insane. It was absolutely insane, and it can, that compounding effect can really last and linger into the next year as well.
Speaking of compounding effects, there's the tropical wave that just entered the Atlantic Ocean from Western Africa that obviously everyone should keep their eyes on as we approach peak hurricane season.
Yeah, we're September 12th, 15th-ish is generally the peak of the tropical season for the Atlantic. And of course, it's 2020, so, we're kind of getting accustomed to this disaster life.
The battle-like year.
Yeah, right on. Well, that'll about do it for this week's On the Spot. JP, thank you as always for joining us. And of course, thank you for watching, and stay tuned, of course, for our continued coverage of Hurricane Laura and the freight market as it unfolds. Have a great week.